All right, welcome back to another episode of the Apparatus Workshop on fire apparatus and emergency equipment. My name is Nick Wilbur, joined with Win Slauch as always. We have a special guest today, Tom Shan. We've had him on before, and we're bringing him back for his expertise. This is a topic that kind of spans the current apparatus industry and goes to the past apparatus industry and kind of some of the changes and expectations of when we're going to spec a rig. And what we're going to talk about today is the boilerplate, kind of what it is, what we can do with it today versus what we were able to do with it before, and some verbiage and things that have been added in over time to help and hurt. And then opening up a bid. So if we're going to competitive bid, how we can set that bid up so that it's successful in getting multiple companies or manufacturers to come in and try bidding against it, and how maybe that might not be the way to go anymore, and maybe some other options and just some discussion on the bid. These two topics came from a conversation we had out at FDIC. We had a listener. Maybe the only listener, but we had a listener come up to us at FDIC and bring up these topics and said, hey, I like what you're doing, but here's some other things that maybe we can cover. So I think they were great topics, and we're gonna dive in. So I'm gonna kick it off to Tom Shan just discuss the boilerplate. So for those that maybe don't know what that is, or maybe never read one completely. What is your thoughts on the boilerplate and what's important about it? What do we need to know about that?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, if you go, back in the day when writing your own spec was commonplace, even beyond people in fleets, small little volunteer department would have some in-house talent or bring folks in from a neighboring department, larger jurisdiction. And then they'd write their own spec, list their requirements, even if it was in a bullet point format. In today's marketplace, the boilerplate, if you use your preferred vendor's specification, regardless of the size of the manufacturer or the size of your respective department, that first 18 to 20 pages of even the manufacturer spec is the vendor's boilerplate telling you what they're going to supply in terms of some documentation, what degree of testing they're going to do, may cover the topics of a pre-construction conference and a final inspection, and a little bit about warranties. But understand that all that's written in the favor of the manufacturer because they're the people that developed the verbiage. So if you think about, put it in a baseball analogy. Right at the beginning of a 3-game or 4-game series, when the respective managers or the bench coaches huddle up around home plate with the umpires, and you'll see people pointing to different areas in the stadium. And what they're doing is going over the ground rules, which means beyond the obvious of where the fair and foul lines are. Here's the little idiosyncrasies of this stadium. What would be in play versus out of play? Most importantly, in a home run, if the ball is not clearly over the wall, if it hits this colored part on top of the padded area and bounces into the field or back into the stands, is that ball in play? Is it, a home run? Whatever. Because every baseball stadium has different dimensions and they have their own little, idiosyncrasies. Well, that's kind of like the way it is in the apparatus industry, if you think about it. Every manufacturer, large, medium, or small, has their own guidelines and their boilerplate for how they standardly operate. And that may fit your community's needs. It may very well understand that it doesn't cover everything that's important to you. So let's just take one example. Let's assume that you're working with a preferred vendor, all right? And the day of the bid opening, you get this nice 3-ring binder, and it's got some blueprints in it, and it's got, hard copy of the document and a couple of other things. And you're looking for it, and you say, hey, to the salesperson, I thought we talked about having a weight analysis with our bid proposal. because we were talking about, remember the disagreements. There were guys on a committee that wanted a 1,000-gallon tank. The majority of the committee wanted a 750. And your recommendation was, well, let's just put the 1,000-gallon tank on it, see how it turns out. Well, how it turns out is like, we don't want to build it and then find out it's going to be overweight. Why didn't we ask for, as one example, having a detailed weight analysis done with the bid? So falling under the guise of requirements to bidders, typically in boilerplate or boilerplate that Nick, Win, and myself that we've worked on in years past, it incorporates at least the following things at a high level. Kind of brief overview as to the design of the vehicle, what things you want the manufacturer to supply with the bid beyond his bid specs, typically at least a blueprint that's got everything dimensioned on it that you want. If your overall height or height of hose beds, cross lays, angle of approach or departure is really important to you, you need to call those out and say, we want those dimensions on the blueprint. Again, understand, everybody in the apparatus industry doesn't have the same level of detail. I hesitate to use the word quality, but I would say attention to detail on the blueprint. Some of the prints are extremely well detailed, have everything dimensioned. And frankly, there's some that look like they were done by my grandson who's into fire trucks. He's 12 years old and he's got a great Etch-a-Sketch, and it's something that they pounded out a day before the bid opening. And it kind of leaves you wondering or hanging, is this thing going to fit the firehouse? Other things like having an electrical load analysis, if it's important to you, a turning radius. If there was discussions about the power plant, if you have different geographic things in your response area with its hilly terrain, you might want to ask to have an engine scan supplied. Then going further, what are your expectations and who's responsible for the cost of travel to and from the factory, for a pre-construction conference, for the final inspection, and then clearly define how you want your exceptions called out. If you're not dealing with just one vendor and you've got a spec that you expect people to respond back to, not everybody can build everything you're asking for. So you need to define and how you want listed a clarification or an exception. It's very easy to put yes, no underneath every paragraph. And I've reviewed thousands of specs at this point to find that people can check yes to that box all day. And then you go to their proposal and find out, well, it's not there, or it's not there in like and kind with the make and model that you were looking for, and then leads you to believe, well, what are we getting? So how to define that? Very important at the end of the show, how to define, to the fire department's benefit, delivery and acceptance. And I realize I'm old school, but those are two different points in time. Delivery means the unit's physically shown up at your fire station, at your fleet facility, and hopefully you've ahead of time gone back to the salesperson's place of business to inspect the rig against the punch list that you had at the factory and to confirm that that's done. And then acceptance is depending upon how your community is set up, who governs the financial portion of your house, whether if it's internal and you're a fire district, or if you are managed by a village or a county or a city, that typically those purchasing organizations have terms and conditions for what they would define acceptance means, which in the case of the vendor, acceptance means I want my money. All right. And over a period of years, delivery and acceptance has kind of been watered down that those two things are one and the same, much like a clarification and an exception. In the many years I spent in the fire apparatus industry, those were two different things. That's different between laying down a bunt, and I'm on first base versus laying down a bunt and I'm out. I didn't run it out because I didn't want to do it. Two distinctly different things. So the boilerplate, and if you are unsure, you need to reach out and get some help on this. If your community doesn't have a purchasing department where they have terms and conditions, you can get those and study those. I'd strongly suggest, whether you're dealing with one or more vendors, to ask them for sample specs and see what their boilerplate looks like. understanding that even if you use one of the nationally recognized purchasing consortiums where they're handling the paperwork on the contract, chances are, unless you ask the question earlier on, at some point you're going to be asked to sign a contract, either a contract from the manufacturer or a contractor from the manufacturer's representatives. And I can assure you that they've been written by very well-trained, highly paid attorneys, that all of that is written in their favor and none of it in the favor of the department, up to and including that even if you had conversations or email traffic back and forth regarding certain things that they were going to cover with respect to warranty or when warranty coverage was going to start, the contract will typically have a statement in there excluding all of that and said, this paperwork that we've supplied to you and the specifications therein, they prevail. And even if you wrote your own spec and we didn't cover that or didn't talk about it, well, that's on you. That's not on us. So kind of like high level overview of the boilerplate to me is the first most important thing in the spec, even ahead of the dimensions. If you aren't keyed in on the dimensions and some of the principal components that are holding your apparatus up, if you fail to develop boilerplate, have a discussion about it, embrace everybody in the organization, maybe even people that aren't on the committee, to find out, for example, when we talked about delivery and acceptance in the world of the apparatus industry means you're accepting it and you're paying for it. Well, some communities, because of how they're structured, well, you submit, quote, the invoice or the bill for payment, and we're going to pay for it in our next meeting, which is net 30 days. And the manufacturer's contract might have specific language in there telling you when you need to have the money up. So a lot of those things need to be covered, particularly now that we're not talking about a couple $100,000 anymore. If you didn't make any kind of prepayment along the way, right, the dealer and the manufacturer that built your fire truck is sitting on one heck of a lot of money that's considered to be work in process, and that he wants to go get that quote off the books and get his money. So all of those kinds of discussions, even if you're the technical nerd, pocket protector nerd, and you're only worried about hose bed dimensions and warning lights, and after that, you're out. All right. There's an awful lot of other things that go into the purchase of the rig that in order for it to be a kind of a clean process where there's no surprises at the end. Again, go back, finish up with my discussion of base. You see the manager, if he's not disputing balls and strikes, because he knows if he comes out of the dugout disputing balls and strikes, he's getting tossed. Even if he doesn't say a word, you're out. All right. He wants to get up and argue a call with the umpire and get in his face. And if it relates back to something with respect to an interpretation, the ball's in play or the ball's, it was a dead ball foul, it's do over. The pitch doesn't count, nothing counts. The runners have to go back to where they were. The manager will, if he didn't understand the ground rules in the beginning, even if it's the bottom of the ninth, it's too late to argue your point. You need to understand that going in before they even throw the first pitch at the top of the first.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things there, and I think a boilerplate today is foreign. It's not foreign to the manufacturers, but it seems like it's almost foreign to the buyers. And then I think a buyer boilerplate seems foreign to the salesman too. When you hand them that boilerplate and say, "Hey, this is it," they look at it and they don't know what to do with it. Is a lot of what I see now. They're not quite sure how to handle. Like you said, the exceptions and do we do yes or no? What do you want me to do here if we don't offer this, or how do you do it? And there's a lot of back and forth. And really, I think it's a negotiation between you and them with their boilerplate, your boilerplate, and trying to make it work. Is kind of where I think that's at now. Like you said, Tom, it sets the rules up, the ground rules for how you're going to build this fire truck, what you expect, what they expect, and you have to pay attention to that, but you have to pay attention to it not only at the beginning when you hand it to them, but throughout the whole process, and make sure that boilerplate carries through all the way through the final contract signing. Because like you said, there are terms and wording in their contract that could void your entire boilerplate if it's not carried through and copied in and signed off on by the representative of the company who's selling you the fire apparatus. You could void everything you discuss. And some of that stuff in that boilerplate could be important to you. So, again, it's that negotiation where you go back and forth. There's going to be certain things that they, agree with or don't agree with, like especially on acceptance and delivery. How long are they going to give you to pay for the truck? The last couple contracts I've looked at have actually kind of contradicted themselves throughout it. So again, there's, hey, what are we actually going to do here? This is what we want. Your contract says 3 different things in it. So we're going to go with ours. Can you put it in your contract? That's how we're going to pay for it. And like you said, if you have to go back and, if it takes us 30 days to approve that, then we either need to, negotiate that out to begin with, that, hey, you have these 30 days or you don't have the 30 days. So the month prior to your truck being due, you're going to have to deal with that process, in your company meeting. So that's the way I see the boilerplates now. Is it's your way to dictate, but it's also a negotiation, and they're not going to give you everything that you want, and you shouldn't give them everything that they want either at the same point. So it's a little bit of back and forth there.
Yeah, good points. There's been a couple departments that had worked with within the last 2 to 3 years, post pandemic, that they knew that they had their preferred vendor. For whatever reason, there was something in a prior purchase that left. Maybe the apparatus committee was naive to it, but the board of fire commissioners or board of directors were really keyed in on some aspects that just kind of left a bad taste in their mouth. So I said, well, why don't we do this? Now, I'll help you develop some boilerplate. You take your salesperson, your preferred vendor, and you let them know this. You don't slap down 24 pages of stuff, the second night that he comes into your station, but to let him know that, we're going to develop boilerplate. And while we're going to continue to work with you, when you put your proposal together, this is what we're thinking. This is what we would like to accomplish with this. And if you need to then run that by, the owner of your company, because understand, depending on the size of the manufacturer, with the customer, there's sometimes you're signing a contract with the dealership. You're not signing a contract with the manufacturing facility. And there's other cases where you're signing it and it was developed by you're signing a manufacturer's contract. Well, even if you're using one of the consortiums to process the paperwork, ask them up front for a copy of, quote, their standard contract. And then you, the apparatus committee, unless you happen to have a lawyer sitting on that, you give that to your board of directors, to your board of fire commissioners, and have them, run that past their attorney. Nick, you made an excellent point about contradictory statements in the contract, that there was a time. Now we're rolling back into the 90s, into the early 2000s, where when the market didn't have the backlog and was not as strong as it is in terms of the amount of inherent business and backlog that everyone has. There were departments early on, Nick, that your dad and I worked with some of the projects with EVR, that their attorney would sit in on one of the final meetings with the apparatus committee and the salesperson and would say, here's your contract. I've marked it up. This is the language we want to get changed. And many times it had to do with warranty. And it was a particular statement called merchantability of fitness, which there was an exclusion that manufacturers were using back then that basically said, hey, if something goes wrong with the rig, we're not really telling you the thing was supposed to be used in a high stress, emergency environment. So if something blows up and goes to kingdom come, and I got really go back, back in the day when people built their booster tanks, and if the lid of your booster tank, because you overfilled it and overpressurized and it blows up and the first new engine company loses water, that's merchantability of fitness. That's not on us. All right. And attorneys would negotiate, 3 or 4 different sections of the contract. And then the committee would look at me and say, guys, that's what you're paying your attorney for. If they're he's now fighting for you. All right. If they're willing to change that, those days, they're gone. The horse and the steamer and the hose wagon that I love, they're over the horizon, right? You're not going to get at any time to get a manufacturer to change, particularly if it's a company contract. If it's a dealership and you've worked with the dealership before and you've got the Win alluded to, you have a working relationship with those folks, then just a polite, healthy discussion. It's not the time to start pounding your fist on the table and say, we got to go do this. But it's the polite process of informing your salesperson or salespeople. All right, you want to do business with them, but it's not business all at their at their venture. You want to have a little bit of input, and if you've had issues in the past with respect to warranty or out of service time or things, there was one manufacturer that we won't mention, and back in the day, they touted, sole source manufacturing. And then people took that a step further to mean like, okay, well, you're responsible for everything on the rig bumper to bumper because you're sole source manufacturing. Well, we're really today, with few exceptions, we're assemblers. There are, custom chassis apparatus manufacturers that build their own cabs, multitude of cabs, build their own bodies in different configurations. But if you think about it, the fire pumps are coming from, one of three different vendors. There's one or two at most, engine choices, unless you're going to have somebody build a tanker and you've got CDL people in your department and you're going to look out to go put the fuller 15-speed, Road Ranger transmission. There's one transmission with two models, unless you're going to be getting into doing a driveline retarder. They're doing a very good job, but they're assemblers. So the warranties fall back to all the different people that they bought the parts from. All right. And not just the person whose nameplate's on the front. So it's addressing those polite needs that you have with your vendor up front. And again, if you haven't ever seen Boilerplate, then reach out to people that have done it, and they can show you some examples. But to just go into the purchasing process blind, thinking that your salesperson, he could be your brother-in-law and he's coming over to your house for Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. All right. Understand the manufacturer's boilerplate, God bless them. It's there to built for them and their advantage, including all of the different warranty statements. So there's nothing in there that really directly benefits. If you lined up three manufacturers and said, this is a fictitious statement to the listeners, completely made up. All right. I bought brand B because his standard warranty was better. I'm telling you, you haven't read his statement of warranty and read the exclusions, because there's nobody here in the fire truck market that's using a marketing thing. Unlike automobiles, back when there was a vendor that came out with, 100,000 mile drive line warranty. There's nobody out there doing that. There's nobody out there that's got a superior paint warranty unless you asked for it, and then chances are you paid for it as well. So the informed consumer needs to get up to speed and find out, where the weak points are in the fleet that you have, and then try to address those politely in the boilerplate.
Yeah, I think there's.
Okay, I was going to hit something real quick for you guys. Like, one thing that I kind of picked up on is, it's not like when you're downloading the new app on your cell phone and it says like, here's the term and conditions, and like you have to accept it to pass go on, the new app. Like, you either accept the terms and conditions or, you don't get the app. I think that's kind of something relatable to the younger generation. Like, that's not how this works necessarily. Everything is negotiable, right? Now, it doesn't mean that everything's going to go your way. And I think it's important not to overplay your cards. Things like you can see back in the day when, the FD&Y had their contract, they had a lot of service needs in their contract where things were going to be fixed within 48 hours and things were going to be towed to places. And there's a lot of verbiage in there is very strong because like Tom was alluding to, in that weak market, building 90 rigs a year was great, or a 90 rig contract was great. Now a lot of those manufacturers don't want to touch it. So even on the bigger you are, the harder it is. And we've heard on podcasts on here, or just listening to or talking to different fleet managers, the bigger your fleet, you see the more variety that the rigs they have now. They're not going to that single manufacturer and trusting them, or relying on them to give them the rigs they need. They have to outsource and just get it from wherever they can. And so, it's definitely a supply and demand, and you don't want to get to that level of desperation where you're just going to sign anything that comes in front of you. The price increases for a while there's people scared of price increases. And so they were signing contracts where they didn't even know what was the boilerplate. They didn't even know what the spec said. They were just signing it because they were afraid that next price increase was going to come. Then you go to pre-engineering, and now here we are 9 price increases later. And now anything that you change is just that much more expensive. So I think there's a lot of things where it's just taking the time in the beginning, like Tom said, getting those ground rules straight and just getting on the same page. At the end of the day, we're at the point now where you might sign a contract with a manufacturer, with a dealership, with a salesperson, and that salesperson and or that dealership can change in the next 4 to 5 years by the time that fire truck's produced. I mean, we saw it with some of the manufacturers coming together. We saw it with some of the dealerships coming together over time. We saw it with salespeople leaving, right, retiring as they age out. So there's all these issues or things that could come up. So if you don't solidify that language, you might be sitting in front of 3 or 4 different people when that time comes to final production and that thing coming down the line. So I think that, you can't overstate how important that is, because if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And I think that's huge.
Yeah, I think that's the key. I think, like Tom said early on, I think that asking for their contract, a sample of their contract up front, so that you can run it through, at the very least, your board of directors, whoever is running the fire company. If you're a larger company, obviously you're going to have your own lawyers that are going to want to look at that. But I think that's key, is to look at that up front, because if you wait till the very end, then you're back in that negotiation process where you could have kind of had that taken care of up front. We want this boilerplate in here. It talks about, today a fixed price contract is almost non-existent. Nobody's going to promise you a fixed price in today's volatile market that we're dealing with, whether it's the inflation that people don't know or things like that. There's going to be some sort of language in there that is going to allow that company to increase the price if necessary. They're not going to take a hit for your fire truck beyond a certain amount of money. And that could be both the dealer and the actual manufacturer. There could be 2 different issues there that you have to deal with. So just because the manufacturer says one thing doesn't mean that the dealer is going to, do the same thing. So you want to make sure that you go through and read that contract. And I know this is a boilerplate thing, but it kind of all ties together, and making sure that at the end of the day, you're happy with everything that you see there. And let's get it out of the way up front so that we can, be clear when it comes down to it. Again, there's a manufacturer that has a price increase this week that if you haven't signed yet, you're back and forth trying to negotiate now, would make little changes with about 2 days to sign a contract, and it becomes really hectic, and with a lot of things going on. So I think Tom had a really good point there, is ask for that contract up front, review it early on, and make sure that you agree with what it says and it agrees with what you say. And that all ties into that boilerplate. A couple other things I think that are kind of in that boilerplate that people don't think about, and like we talk about warranties being that important factor in there, is what do you expect for this to be covered? But, again, with, like Tom said, with parts and pieces and then putting them together, that's kind of out the window. But what you can put in there is who is going to handle that warranty, at least for the first 1 year, bumper to bumper, whatever the manufacturer's warranty is. Who do you expect to handle it? Because if you read a manufacturer's warranty, they're going to cover their stuff only. They're not going to cover the engine, the pump, the things like that. You're going to have to go out and deal with that on your own, unless you specify for the first year of this, I expect you to deal with the entire warranty issues. Anything you have, it's your fault or it's your problem, you deal with it. I want to make one phone call and I want to get the problem fixed. But if you don't have that in there, the limitations in that warranty throughout it can kind of put it back into your court, where now you're spending hours and hours on the phone trying to get that. And the other thing too is we talk about getting into specs and opening things up, and also is to make sure that you identify in that boilerplate what you expect out of that manufacturer after you buy the fire truck. If you live, where I live, I'm lucky. The dealer's 40 minutes away from me. It's not a big deal to run a fire truck up there to get fixed. But if if I have to go 2 hours to get to a dealer, and I have one paid person working, and I got to take that one guy out, and they'll still find somebody else to do it. Now that depletes my entire fire department for the day. So that's something that you want to have in that boilerplate, is how are we going to handle this in these situations? And again, that's something that can be written into your spec as we get into that. But you want to kind of identify that up front too, that this is what's expected as we deal with this.
Yeah, just taking a little bit between situation that I had, leveraging off about what Win and Nick just said, had a department that had purchased rigs from this company with this sales agent, which also then became their warranty center, right? Understanding that, the larger companies and with the dealerships, pretty much to maintain representation of that product line, you have to be able to have, maintenance and service and warranty support. Well, in this case, after the rig was delivered, because of changes in the industry that Nick had mentioned, this company now is no longer the, quote, the authorized service vendor, which was in the community adjacent to where the city was. So they now we're told, well, that you need now to head west, young man, and it's now 2.5 hours to go out to the people that are doing the warranty, that are quote, our authorized warranty and service center. Well, that was then a long negotiation and discussions between the vice president of the company and a high level official within the fire department to say, we don't have the kind of staffing, we have, as I think they called back in the day, was not this community, but roster staffing, which meant everything's staffed, but it's at minimum. And we're not, God bless us, there's nobody, we're not overtiming anybody, but yes, by the way, nobody's running heavy today. If you're telling me that I need to now go 2.5 hours and have a chase car, I am not running a fire department here to run vehicles around for warranty when we used to be able to take it and cross the city line to get there. And again, can't always predict those kinds of things, but understanding if you've had situations like that, or your warranty service provider had another situation where the entire dealership changed, they no longer represented that manufacturer. The rig had taken quite a long time for it to be produced, and they were used to getting updates from the salesperson. It was a very, very nice person. It was very, very upfront, forthwith. But now he can't even get access because he's not representing that company anymore. He's have to go to a third party to find out, well, what's going on with Tom Shan's, new mini pumper here, because we can't get, we can't get any G2 intelligence on it. And it just makes everybody just all the more frustrated. And then you begin, unfortunately, to lose confidence in the vehicle before you even get it. All right. And then everything's spinning upside down.
Yeah, I think things that were standard before that, you get used to depending on your manufacturer or even your dealership. We talked about it a little bit before, but drawings, weight analysis, electrical load analysis, engine analysis. If you're not going out to competitive bid and you're not upfront with the ground rules, you might never get one. I know rigs that were spec that never got an updated drawing. When you ask for, a spec, they give you the verbiage spec, the long verbiage spec, and they give you a generic drawing that's not anything, or that's somewhat like your vehicle, but not exactly like your vehicle. And now it's, well, what are you used to working off of? How does the committee handle that, and where can you go to kind of get that going? Other thing, pictures while the vehicle's being built, midpoints and finals. Well, midpoints, if you're getting pictures, maybe you don't need to do a midpoint, but maybe this manufacturer, this dealership now doesn't do pictures, or maybe now you need to go do a midpoint because the only time you're going to see the rig before it's delivered is going out there and doing that midpoint to make sure things are going well. So there's a lot of things that as you sort through this, that all goes back to price. If you're doing a pre-engineering, a midpoint inspection and a final, and you're bringing 3 or 4 people out per trip, that changes the price of things. You pay for that. So if you haven't figured that out up front and you have a budget for your fire truck, it doesn't matter that you want XYZ on there. You might not get it if that's what you need to do the inspection. Wynn's brought this up numerous times on here, but you want to get the thing on a lift. You want to pump it. You want to do the pump test. You want to, weigh it out there. Any of those things that you want to do, some of that stuff costs money depending on the manufacturer, depending on the dealership, all those. So you got to lay that out right up ahead. Again, that's money well spent. But if we have a fixed budget, we need to understand how much of that money is coming out ahead of time before we even look at the gizmos and gadgets, because you don't want to be playing that game at pre-engineering or even later in final inspection where you show up and now you don't have access to the things you need to do to make sure that fire truck is running. So I think, there's a lot to cover there in boilerplate. I think we hit a decent amount. I think the other part of this question was opening up the bid. So I think we can discuss bids and then, what that looks like, some of the different purchasing options and what a bid was, what a bid is, and then how we can kind of maybe get some manufacturers to come out and bid, and maybe some experiences you guys have had with the bidding process or lack thereof. I don't want to lead it on either end, and how that's kind of going for you guys of late.
Okay, so again, an old school term was saying open competitive bid, which meant the spec was non-proprietary. It means there wasn't anything in the spec that would knock a potential, vendor out from bidding. Again, the marketplace for the last 10 or 15 years, the majority of fire trucks, right, wrong, or indifferent, are purchased where the customer has identified his or her preferred vendor, and they go down the road, whether it's a negotiated sale, it's a public bid because legally they need to do that, even if they just get one bid. In a lot of fire departments or different jurisdictions, says it needs to go to public bid, and you need to have 3 bids or get one bid back with the number and 2 no bids. All right. And times people would play games around that by, working with their preferred vendor, quote, Xeroxing the spec, then telling all the other vendors, oh, we wrote the spec ourselves. And when you open up the bid package in about 30 seconds, because every manufacturer has their own sequence of the spec, has their own bid format and font, you can identify that this is brand whatever's spec. So if you wrote this yourself, can you show me your typewriter? Because apparently you're working in the place of the manufacturer. So I might go swinging down, last round here, Nick and Win, but I'm still a firm believer in when it's prudent for you to do it. All right. You're not doing this because somebody told you have to. What your goal is to acquire a well-designed, well-engineered rig that is competitively priced. All right. And one way to do that is to work with larger fleets, work with people that have bought rigs around you, hire outside help if you've never done this before. All right. But work on developing what your requirements are by starting out with the bullet list format. And most importantly, then, if you take the whole feel of all the different fire truck manufacturers, if there's 3 or 4 that you would seriously consider, you need to invite them into your station and go over your bullet list with them that you've supplied to them ahead of time. So here's the couple pages. Here's the major components we want. Here's some dimensional things we need. And oh, by the way, I've had this happen 3 times in the last year. Oh, by the way, with all this stuff, it can't be any higher than 117 inches. So you might have these envisions of sugar plums that you've got this great rescue engine with 24-inch deep coffin compartments that you can swim in, but then you find out what the overall height of those things, it's going to be 10'6". Guess what? That doesn't fit into your door opening, so we can't do it. So it really, requires a lot more work on behalf of the apparatus committee to do the research, to reach out to manufacturers. One suggestion that I heard that it said that, even failing, if you fail to talk to prospective vendors, you just can't put your spec out and think that people are just automatically going to come to the show, all right? Because they're out busy selling their fire truck to people that have identified themselves that they're already going to buy their rig, or they're down to it's between you and one other vendor, and we're using one of the purchasing consortiums. We're not writing anything here. You got quote. I've heard this several times, which is even scarier. You know what we want, all right? Put together your package, and we'll evaluate it. And we're not legally mandated to buy the lowest bid. All right. And that's something when you get in with the work that I did for a number of years for both the Navy and Marine Corps, we wrote open competitive specs because we were going through either DLA or GSA. We would get multiple bids. And the term that was used most frequently by the people there is that the lowest bid that is technically compliant with what your requirements are. So if you know what your requirements are, you've defined the dimensions, overall dimensions of the vehicle, you've defined the major components. I'll give you a straight out example. All right. We had buying 6 rigs for one of the organizations that I mentioned. We had a base model and had several options individually to fit the different installations, because some were going on the East Coast, some were going on the West Coast. But the base maximum overall length of the vehicle was 372 inches, and we were looking for a hose bed height loaded with a 750-gallon water tank between 64 to 68 inches. So 68's the max, 372's the max overall length. And back then they would only send you the lowest bid price. So you had no idea, no visibility who else bid, unlike a public bid opening back in the day. You open up your bids in your community at 5 o'clock, and the 4 manufacturers would show up. Everybody put a big, sealed binder on the table, and the secretary of the fire company, whatever, would open them up one at a time, read the person, make sure it had the bid bond in it, and read the number, and then set it back on the table. We go to the next one. With the federal government, you only got the lowest bid. So the first thing I would do is go look at the number of exceptions and clarifications. And I would see only 3. And I'm like, and not very well worded at that. Let's look at the blueprint. And the overall length on their blueprint, again, max was 372, was 388. And the hose bed, after doing some addition and subtraction, because they didn't clearly call out the dimension that we asked for, I found out the hose bed's 91 inches in the air. All right, well, we'll keep going on our merry way, and we ended up with about 65 exceptions. I had to document in detail every one of them and said, swing and a miss, send me the next batter. All right, and that was the way things went. So I was very attuned to writing what I felt was, I never had anybody accuse me of saying, oh, that's a brand, you fill in the name spec. Now, if you dimension your body length to 3 decimal points, all right, and say that your compartments have to be 24.75 inches minimum depth, well, now you're getting into some murky waters when you're using a manufacturer's dimension just because you think, well, hey, that'll work. Well, what's the difference between something that's 23 and 23.75? Can you tell me what you're going to do with that other 3/4 of an inch of usable space? So you have to be judicious. But if you've standardized on alternators, batteries, tires, warning lights, things like that, ground ladder makes, you can put all that stuff in. That's not excluding anybody. But when you start writing something in there, a foam system, for example, that only one vendor can supply, or a proprietary fire pump that only one person can supply. Well, now you've basically you've shown your hand. That's the fire truck I want to buy. Well, then go buy it. All right. It takes a lot of time and effort for a salesperson to put together a spec in response to what you've written, particularly if you have all the stuff you've asked for in the boilerplate. You need to be respectful of their time. But again, that it's not going to come easy, because the fire apparatus marketplace and the salespeople, not to speak in a disrespectful manner, but there's darn few that I've worked with over the years, and certainly even people in the last 4 to 5 that say, when was the last time you bid an open spec? You maybe sold those people products back in the 90s and the early 2000s. Something happened, change of administration. You still think you got a pretty good shot, but you see they bought somebody else's rig in the interim back in 2017. They've now asked you to come in and bid it. And if you've got a good product line and you're a good salesperson, you're going to be like, unfortunately, the response you're going to get, what I've been told by 2 vendors, manufacturers, that I think they build a pretty good rig, that said, if you write our spec, we'll bid the truck. If you don't write our spec, we're not bidding. Had that told directly to my face. In other words, they're selling eggs or donuts or whatever their product is, and they're selling enough of them, they're not interested in playing in an open field. It's just the nature of where we are now. And I frankly don't see that changing unless the backlog drops down dramatically. There's some mediation in prices that, what Win alluded to, that they've got more than enough business. They don't need to go play in the AA or single A arena. They're in the major leagues, and we're just going to play major league teams.
No, I agree. I think the amount of work that a committee or, somebody like us who has to write that spec for you, that they have to put into that is so much. And then the amount of work that the dealer or the salesman has to put in to get it back to you is a lot. And like you said, they're selling enough fire trucks. Maybe that individual salesman's not, and maybe he'll be willing to put the work in, but depending on who you're buying from and who you're dealing with, they don't need that. They can go sell a demo truck and make, $30,000 less, and not have to spec that, do all that work on that spec for you, and not have to deal with your boilerplate and things like that. So, and especially when you, like Tom said, when you get a spec that is not, open, or is one manufacturer oriented, or, calls for an independent front suspension, which, now is a little bit easier to get, is available basically all the way across the board. But, if you used to do that and somebody saw that, I mean, they're not going to take their time anymore, because you're calling for proprietary, you're basically saying, this is what I want. Yeah, I need to get 3 other prices, but this is really what I want. This is what we're going to go with. So you have to be open, and you have to bid apples to apples there. And I think the other thing is, even when people bid, is that if you're not, again, upfront with the salesman of what you're looking for, then you're not going to have an even bid when you go to open it. If you're not writing out a full set of specifications and you're trying to bid some different way, you're just trying to price things out. But again, you have a 1,500 gallon per minute pump from this manufacturer and a 2,000 gallon per minute pump from this one. That's not fair. That's not apples to apples. If you're not telling them that you want airbags or some other safety feature in that truck, then the people who are trying to bid it are going to bid the lowest, especially if you're going for the lowest price bid. They're going to try to bid. They're not going to bid all those options in, because it's just going to increase the price. So again, you could have one truck who says, all right, well, our standard is to add airbags into it. And another one, yeah, I'm not going to add airbags into this because I got to get the price down. So you're kind of shortchanging yourself on that one in that sense. Whereas if you go into it and you say, this is what we want, we expect to have airbags, we expect to have all of these things in it, then again, it kind of opens that up to allow, that open bidding process, that open competitive bid.
Yeah, excellent points. I've had last couple of pre-construction conferences when the fire department asked, we would get to brand of seats and axles as two things, and said, well, what's your standard seat? And then they'll mention it. It goes, oh, okay, well, that's your own private label seat. Who makes it? Because we use these seats, and this is what we have in our fleet. Can you supply them? Well, yeah, but that's our standard seat. Well, if you're running a fleet, you would like to think things like seats, and then we'll mention axles. So the customer had standardized this axle on the front and the rear with air suspension on the back. So they asked, what's your standard front axle? And the response back is, well, it was, it's independent front suspension. Well, we don't run independent front suspension. We run a straight beam axle on everything in our fleet, got 60 plus rigs. IFS might be great, but we're not buying these rigs and we're not jacking the price up. Can you go supply that axle? And it goes to what you mentioned. When it's what the salesperson's comfortable selling. It's what somebody told him as standard. All right. It just drives me crazy when you get to valves, in the pump plumbing system, and certain plumbing runs, deck guns. When you put here's the make and model of deck gun that we have, and you tell them here's the make and model of the stream shaper and the smoothbore tips, and you can keep the fog nozzle. We don't want the damn thing anyway. And if it's the mountable, the portable base, the kind of inlet, and then you go read their spec, and you got the wrong wagon pipe in there. Oh, well, that's what came up. That's standard. That tells me you didn't read my spec, all right? Which then goes to the larger issue. Again, not damning the industry, but where they are. But so few people bid stuff on an open spec. Your salesperson might know his product inside and out. The order, if you were looking for where compartment lights are, he'll know exactly where to go find that in the spec, all right? You write a spec that's open, and it'd be like, well, I didn't see what brand the compartment lights you asked for, so quote, I put in our standard LED strip lights. So who made them? Well, they're proprietary, and now, where are they made? Well, are they made in the USA? No. Okay, well, I think I want to keep, with what's going on right now in the country, non-political statement, I think we want to get as much U.S. content on this bad boy as we can, all right, if nothing else, to be able to stock the parts. That because it's standard for you doesn't mean that it's either A, standard for me, or I don't know a better word, Nick or Win, to say, but it's not acceptable to my fire department, all right? If there's multiple brands that you have, I'm willing to pay more money to get something that I've already got in my fleet. I'm not looking for the standard or for something that is the cheapest. If this is what we run with, and here's the brand, I respect the fact that you've got a bunch of all these other, it used to be one of the things in reviewing the Navy Marine Corps specs with one vendor. I would just count up the different brands of lights, right? Starting the easy stuff, headlights, tail lights, and then you'd get down to all the running board lights and things. And one time, this one vendor said there was 18 different brands of lights on these rigs. I said, these rigs are going to military installations all over the world, not just in the United States. I said, so if this thing ends up and it's going to one of the Navy bases in Spain, I said, where's the local vendor for this light? Is that available overseas, or what's a transferable part number for something? And the guy looked at me like I had two heads, and I'm like, it's people can't stock 18 different brands and models of lights. After you get past the warning light stuff, I'm out. Let's try to standardize some of this stuff.
I think the hard part too is the work, and you guys both have kind of mentioned it, but I had helped spec a truck with College Park pre-pandemic, and you put out this bid, and we had gotten 3 bids back. You're writing an entire bid. You have to tell them every single thing that you're looking for, down to model numbers, down to the brass tacks of the entire fire truck. So you're talking, 100, 200 pages, depending on how detailed you want to get. Then that's kind of the easy part. Then you go to the hard part, which is reviewing the 3, 4, 2 specs or bids that you get back from the manufacturer. You have to go line by line and figure out if that's acceptable or not. And, as Tom had said, there's people I would take exceptions or give clarifications and do the proper way in the beginning part of your spec to say, hey, out of these 300 things that you gave us, these 20 we're going to take an exception to. we can't do them, but here's the like product that we provide. And these, 15 items, we're going to give clarification. You said X, Y, Z. We provide X, Y, and a Z equivalent. It's the same thing, but just different wording, just to give you a heads up. That stuff doesn't really happen. You have to go and find that stuff now. And like we were talking about with price, you go in a competitive bid and they just want to give you a cheap price, then they're going to give you all the non-standard or all the standard things and not what you necessarily asked for, and see how many things they can get by. And it might be, back in the day it was to be a cheaper fire truck. Now I think it's just to save time. They're going to click, click, click and be done with the spec and hit print and be done with it, just so they can get it off their plate. Because you have to remember, they're not making money by the time you engage a manufacturer and a salesperson until they get a paycheck in their pocket. It's close to 5 years in some aspects, because the fire truck has to be delivered, paid for, and then processed through to the manufacturer, to the dealership, and then the dealership would then cut a check to the person who sold you the fire truck. So the work that you're trying to have them do up front now, you have to be aware of, because they're not going to see any of that money for a while. And go back to Win's demo fire truck or stock unit, that's something that once that thing clears, they get a paycheck right away. So they're going to work harder to get money in their pocket today. If you're a poor salesman right now, you're working for 5 years from now. If you don't have food on the table today, you ain't going to make it 5 years. So it's hard to do some of that work.
Excellent point, Nick. And no, we're getting towards the end, but this following up on that. So stock units, program units, rigs that are already pre-built and pre-engineered. That's where a portion of the marketplace is going. The salesperson recognizes his income right away. There's nobody reading the spec, because now you're just looking at the vehicle. All right, you're looking at the vehicle if it's already built. You're looking at a blueprint, a couple of the major highlights. So the customer now has a fixed price. He doesn't have to worry about any kind of price increase. He gets the vehicle faster, and the salesperson can move on to the next sale. And that's great. But with that part of the marketplace, it's almost like saying, okay, I've fast-tracked and I bypassed after I did so well in freshman year of high school, all right, and I took all the PSATs or whatever the heck they call it now. I aced the SATs. I'm in college, right, after serving 1 year of high school, right? I lost all that other experience, and that's where part of the apparatus industry is going. You think that you can flop down, even if a well-written, well-developed spec that you wrote and authored, and you could sign off and, swear in a court of law. Yeah, I'm responsible for 100% of this thing with input from everybody else that gave it to me, and gave it to your friendly salesperson. Chances are he or she is not capable of reading that and discerning exactly what you want, because they can just point and click. All right. And they'll go to something that's close, 80 or 85% of what you want. And I've had people say, well, hey, we can detail. The other great white lie is we can detail that at pre-construction. You can if you got Dad's Visa Gold card, because 2 or 2.5 years from now, when you do pre-construction, you're going to find out, even if you want to change a color of a light on the back, because you're now running different, alternating color lights on the back that you weren't doing when you signed the contract, that's going to cost you money, even if it's just a light color change. I can promise you that. And it just starts there, and then it compounds.
Yeah, I think that, that kind of ties back. I think you can tie that back into the boilerplate is again, because of that, they don't have that experience in writing their specs out. And not even that, it's even the dealers and the manufacturers don't have time with the way the manufacturer, the process is, and the amount of apparatus they're building is. Even though you request something, like we talked about drawings, I want an exact drawing of the fire truck you are proposing. You really have to pay attention, because 9 times out of 10, what they provide you is not an exact drawing of what you want, even though that's what you asked for, because they don't have the time to provide that for you until you sign a contract. And even then, the first time you see an exact drawing might be when you're at the pre-con, depending on when that is. So that could be within 6 months of signing the contract, or that could be 4 years down the road, 3.5 years down the road. So again, just because you ask for something doesn't mean that they're prepared to give it to you and you're going to get what you want out of it. So, I think, making sure that you identify what you want, try to call it out at the beginning, push it through the whole process, especially if you're going to go. And just because you have a boilerplate doesn't mean that you have to write a full spec to go with it. If dealing with your manufacturer you buy fire trucks from all the time, you still want to have that boilerplate. You want to have that negotiation back and forth and dictate the way this is going to go. Like Tom said before, what are the ground rules on how we're going to build this truck? And the ground rules from the last time you built a truck could be completely different from the ground rules that you built this time. Because hopefully you learn something, and you want to carry that through and make sure, again, that you have the best contract for you, not necessarily for them, which is what they're trying to deal with.
Couldn't agree more, Win. The old adage, educated consumers are best customer, right? If you have the preferred vendor, nothing wrong with that, but just make sure that there's some things that the ground rules are laid out.
Right.
Don't try to figure out the ground rules in the fifth inning when the play doesn't go your way. It's not your time to come bounding out of the dugout and yell, scream foul, right?
Right. And
should have found that out early on.
I think the key for all of this is to just be cognizant of the amount of time that it takes, whether it is to write a boilerplate, write a spec on not only the fire company's end or the fire department or the municipality's end, but also the amount of time that dealer and that salesperson is going to have to put into it. And if you're not going into it open and saying, hey, this is what we're looking for, this is what we want, this is what we expect, then don't expect them to put a whole lot of effort into it either. Again, that's kind of where we are today. They don't want to put it unless, they're sure they're going to get something or there's a good chance that they can provide you a truck. They're not going to put that effort in there. You have to work really hard to kind of, explain to them that, hey, we want this to be open. Talking about time, I just wrote a spec that could have absolutely no brand names in it. Nothing. So everything had to be spelled out. And again, it had to be open so that, I had to go through and look at every manufacturer's lights that are available and fit, we need a light between these, this size and this position, and had to be open. So just the amount of work involved with that. And then again, the amount of work that they're going to have to do when they review it is going to be pretty immense. Because everything, it can be, different. What are the lumens? What are we using as a determining factor for this? How are we picking out which is the best light here? And so just the time that this takes is, you just have to be cognizant on both ends, and understand that process.
Yeah, and I mean, that's after all the needs assessments and stuff are done and you actually know what type of rig and the equipment you're going to carry on it, right? We're just talking about a slice of the pie here, and there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. I think the one thing we didn't necessarily hit, which we can cover in a later podcast and it's kind of just put in your minds to kind of consider, is the ramifications of the boilerplate, right? And if the terms are not met, I think that's something that needs to be discussed very early on. We didn't really talk about it much, and we can kind of dip and just give closing thoughts on that here quickly as we leave out. But I know we've run into situations where the terms were not being met, and you kind of can get bullied a little bit. And so I think you really have to lay that stuff out and your expectations. And if those things aren't met, what should happen after that? Because if you just lay out, here's the rules of the game with no real, punishments and I'm not trying to say that that's what you should be thinking about, but what happens if these things aren't met? And you got to think about the market today. In 4 years from now, they could just be like, oh, we'll start again. And that puts you 4 years back again. I mean, there's a lot of, weight on the manufacturer's side. So I think it's really important to consider all of those options and figure out from beginning to end how we're going to enforce this contract and how we're going to follow it through. You're dealing with someone who has more money, more time, and is not in an emergency to get a fire truck. And so, you really have to consider what you find important and not just put a whole bunch of baloney in there either. So I think there's a great thing of just getting the relationships together with the people you're dealing with, Salesforce, dealership, manufacturer, all in between, and just, shaking hands, singing Kumbaya, and getting on the same page, because there's a lot that could go wrong throughout the entire process. So, we've been at it for about an hour. I think we covered a lot of stuff there, a lot of deep, law stuff. If you want to go take a master class or some sort of learning expedition on writing contract law and stuff, you can do that after this podcast and maybe touch the surface on some more things. But I'll shoot it to you first, Tom, and Win next. Just parting thoughts on all of this as we kind of close out.
Well, thanks, Nick. Wide-ranging subject. Just engage your preferred vendor or the vendors early and often. Have sit-down discussions if your intent is to go the route that, even if you're just going to do boilerplate and you want to make sure that you get two prices, right? Somebody said, hey, with the cost of fire apparatus, I might love to death the experience we've had with this brand, but I got a tough time when the last rig we bought was $850,000, and that almost took the board of directors, in the shock, and now they're telling us it's 1.3, and we're going to wait 48 months. I'm just under a lot of pressure. I need to get two prices, all right? And just to have those kind of conversations up front. Everyone's situation is different. The more you can do and the more polite, intelligent discussions you can have with your vendor or vendors up front will put you in a position, hopefully, to achieve a fair degree of success. That the process, even though it's longer and you're going to have a lot more time, will not be quite as stressful as some of the projects that we've seen happen, where people they get so frustrated, just throw their hands up and everybody's mad at everybody, and it's not a good situation.
Yeah, I would say, have those conversations up front. To go back to Tom's analogy, lay the ground rules out, get the ground rules as even as possible throughout the whole process. Make sure you see what a contract is going to look like on the end, and make sure that your paperwork or your terms are carried through the entire process. Don't do all this work up front and then sign their contract without making sure that your terms are in there as well. Again, make sure that the verbiage covers what you have in there. A lot of them say, if not written, accepted in writing, then their contract voids everything else. So make sure that you know what you're signing, that your terms are in there. Again, when you are going to that specification process, it has to be apples to apples as much as possible. Even when you're comparing fire trucks from brand A between fire departments, those two fire trucks are never apples to apples. So just because somebody over here paid one price for this truck and the next fire company overpaid, they paid $300,000 less for what seems to be the same truck. They're not apples to apples. And when you're bidding and you're doing that specification process, the only way to truly get it, even, is to make sure it's apples to apples as best as possible. So don't put proprietary things in one. Make sure that your measurements and your dimensions are even and are, open wide enough that they cover a variety of manufacturers. And then you'll hopefully, with decent conversation with those manufacturers, get responsive bids back and have a decent process going through that, and get a competitive fire truck for the cost that you want, or not that you want, but it is, at least, doable.
Yeah, I think to close it out, everything these guys said, times 1,000. I think getting help early and often, whether it's from outside, inside the fire department, outside the fire department, in the same municipality or some sort of work group, right? Whether it's a commission or whatever, getting lawyers involved early and often for your side. And then outside, third party consultants too are a thing that you should consider. Even if it's just not even a consultant, but just somebody next door that just went through a purchasing process, within the last year or two, go buy them a meal and sit down and figure out what they would have done differently. I don't know there's anybody out there that goes and buys a fire truck that doesn't learn something throughout the process, including the three people on this call now. Every time we go out there, different manufacturer, different vendor, different salesperson, you're learning something along the way. So the more that you can engage other people that have gone through it, so especially recently, the more you're going to have to go and be an informed customer or consumer. And again, question everything respectfully, right? Ask those questions. And the more that you write down on that spec, the more you're going to limit yourself to an extent. So, stick to the important stuff that's really important to you. When you start dimensioning out, frame rail sizes and not just vehicle height, that's when you start limiting people, and you might not be doing it on purpose. So take those big dimensions, the big things that matter, put those in the spec, and that'll help kind of keep that spec open. The more that you write in there, the more that you run into that issue. You could run into the issue of limiting it down and getting manufacturers out. So, hopefully you guys got something from this. A lot of information. We might do a follow-up. Hopefully the market gets better and everything turns to a better end, and we can do a happier one down the road. But I appreciate you guys listening in. Again, this is Fire Apparatus Emergency Equipment. You have any feedback, any questions from this podcast, or any again, ideas moving forward? This came from a listener, which we appreciate. You can reach out, Nick, N-I-C-K, Wilbur, W-I-L-B-U-R, at evr.solutions. And again, any questions, anything you need, feel free to reach out there, and suggestions. Have a great rest of your day. Be safe, and we'll catch you on the next podcast. Thanks again, Tom. Thanks, Win. We'll see you guys later.